Welcome to Red Eyes Creations Radio. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Henrik Palmgren. This is Internet Talk Radio, coming to you from the west coast of Sweden. Our website is redeyescreations.com. Go there, check it out for our news, radio archives, live programs, short films, links, resources, and of course our member section filled with material for you. And today we're going to talk about a very important story, hidden from history, the Canadian Holocaust, the genocide of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. We have Kevin Annett with us to talk about this and his film Unrepentant. And this is available right now on video, on Google Video. We have had it linked up on Red Eyes, so you might have seen it. The documentary film reveals Canada's darkest secret, the deliberate extermination of Indigenous or Native American peoples, and the theft of their land under the guise of religion. And Kevin Annett is a former minister who blew the whistle on his own church, and after he learned of thousands of murders in its Indian residential schools. The website that you need to visit is hiddenfromhistory.org. That's hiddenfromhistory.org for much more information, the latest developments for the film, of course. And I'm also going to ask a little bit more about the book Hidden from History later in the program about that. So again, this is a very important story that has its roots within the organized church and the government. It's going to be really enlightening talking with Kevin more today. So with that, welcome to the program, and thank you very much for coming on, Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Where do we begin in a way? This is a big story, but I think the logical thing here is to start from the top, and if you can, for the audience that might not be familiar with the story, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of the story that you have been kind of uncovering for over, I guess, 10 or 15 years now, Kevin.
Yeah. Well, the story really began for me in 1992. I had been ordained as a minister in the United Church of Canada for about 2 years, and that's the largest Protestant church in Canada. It was actually set up by the government back in 1925, but I was ordained as a minister there in 1990, and 2 years later, I went to the west coast of Canada on Vancouver Island to a small community called Port Alberni. And traditionally, that was the spot where a lot of the missionary activity happened among the west coast native nations. And I didn't know that at the time. Like a lot of white Canadians, I was very ignorant of our own history, knew nothing really about the residential schools and what had gone on in them. So I went and I was working as a minister there. In the first few months, I opened a food bank and began to invite local Native people into the church. And that's when I first began to hear these stories of children dying in the local residential school that had been run by my church at the time, the United Church, for over 50 years. I began to invite these people into the church and allow them to speak from the pulpit, and we began to hear more of these stories. But as I learned more, I found that the church at the time was in no way willing to look at any of these things. This is before any of the lawsuits had begun. And so I was told in no uncertain terms to be quiet and not to look into this stuff. At the time, I was married and had 2 small daughters, and there was a lot of pressure being brought to bear that simply not to look at these things. But after about 3 years, the boot came down, so to speak, and after I had written a letter, I discovered that the church, there'd been a whole history of churches that had basically stolen native land initially to set up their missions, then selling off that native land to various logging companies. And in this case, the United Church had a close relationship with a company called Macmillan Bloedel that eventually was bought up by the biggest logging company in the world, a U.S. company called Weyerhaeuser. Mm-hmm. And they were profiting off stolen native land thanks to the church, who was handing over this land to them. And that was a real concern to me because according to our church policy, you weren't allowed to do that. You were supposed to return the land to the native people and not sell it off to your white corporate friends, So I wrote a letter about that, just citing our church policy, and within 4 weeks I was just summarily removed from my pulpit. No review, no questions, no cause at all. And eventually I was thrown out of the church altogether at the cost of about $250,000. So, all of that came down on me in the early to mid-1990s. And as a result, my family fell apart. My wife left me and filed for divorce. And the church actually helped her in her lawsuit against me in divorce court. She got custody of her 2 daughters. So all of this was it was a terrible thing happening to me. But as that happened more and more, I began to learn more about why it was going on, and one thing led to another.
We know that genocide, so to speak, has been going on for a long time. We can talk about the root of that a little bit later, but in regards to the, murders that you've uncovered, if you would to kind of give us a little bit of time frame on where we are here, so to speak, on the map. Is this something that just happened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, or does this, continue to this day? Do you know, Kevin?
Well, it does. The high death rate does continue to this day, and it's almost like the aim has always been the same: to get Native people off the land, to get the resources, to keep them imprisoned in their own country, if you like, by putting them in a lower class of citizenship than anybody else through a thing called the Indian Act. So that's always been the aim, but the methods have changed over the years. The residential schools were set up in the 1880s, and they lasted over a century. The last one didn't close till 1996. Basically what it was is, in the West, up until the late 1800s, something like 90% of the native population had been wiped out, mostly through smallpox. And the remnant populations saw their children carted off into these schools where half of them never came back. We found the death rate in the residential schools consistently for over 50 years. The death rate was around 50%. So, half of these children died off because of a practice even described by Indian agents and medical doctors from the government. There was a very famous report by a guy called Dr. Peter Bryce,
yes,
who studied the health conditions in the Western residential schools. He found that children who were sick with tuberculosis were being deliberately housed with the healthy, and then nobody was ever treated. And then, they'd be dying en masse. We figured that over a century, over 50,000 children died that way. And the government's even acknowledged this. Last year, they acknowledged the 50% death rate figure, and that's even being reported in some of the major newspapers now in Canada. But it's kind of like they say, oh, yeah, well, this thing happened, but in effect, nobody's to be held accountable for it. The churches who are primarily the ones responsible for that, they've never been held accountable, and no one has even ever gone to trial in Canada for the death of a child in a residential school. So it's an incredible denial and cover-up happening around this, even though they've acknowledged, that these were very high death rates.
But the system, so to speak, I'm not familiar with it. Residential schools, define that for the audience that are not familiar with that.
Well, another term is just Indian boarding schools. It was a law brought in 1920 where every native child who was older than 7 had to go into one of these schools, and it was basically far away from where they lived quite often. They lived there full time. Officially they were allowed to go home in the summer, but a lot of the kids were just kept year long. So I've talked to a lot of survivors of these places who tell me that they were kept there for 10 years or more, and they never saw their parents, they never saw their relatives. And these were really what they were internment camps. The children received very little education. The formal education stopped after a couple of years. They were basically given the chance to learn to read and write, but no higher education. They were put to work as cheap labor. The children, the girls as domestic servants, the boys working as field hands, and it was to create like a permanent underclass. And that's still the effect in the Aboriginal world today. You asked earlier, how is it still going on? Well, I work in an area in Vancouver called the Downtown East Side. It's one of the poorest areas of Canada. It's over half the people who live there are Aboriginal, and they die at a rate 20 times the national average. It's not uncommon to see people die in their 30s and 40s from diabetes, from suicide, from violence. All of this, if you look at the people who are suffering, all of them went through these residential schools. They were terrorized from a young age, brutalized. I mean, some of the things going on in there. They had electric shock torture chairs they set up. They had sterilization programs where and this has already been the subject of lawsuits. They had hospitals operated on the West Coast where they would sterilize thousands of native children as soon as they reached puberty. It was in order to exterminate the population, to get native people off the land and depopulate areas that the whites wanted, especially the areas that were very had a lot of resources.
Oh yeah.
The lumber and the minerals and the fisheries. Definitely, they were targeted for that, and so this was all part of kind of a bigger plan of really ethnic cleansing.
And this, as we said here, this has been well, pretty much, I guess, going on since day one, since the European came to, over to the American continent, basically, and this has just continued. And now the connection here between, let's say, the residential school system over there in Canada, then, what is there any kind of clear connection between that and what the United Church is doing? And also, if you can, for us, explain a little bit about the United Church. Is that a Catholic Protestant branch? What is it?
No, it's the biggest Protestant church in Canada. These boarding schools were run by all the main churches. The Roman Catholics ran about 2/3 of them, and then the United Church ran the rest, along with the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And those three churches are responsible for most of the residential schools. The United Church played a big role because it was set up by the government as part of their plan to kind of assimilate the immigrant population. Like after World War I, a lot of people were coming from Europe over to Canada, and the establishment here was very concerned that they were going to get swamped by all these, foreign populations. And they considered Native people as in the same category as immigrants. They were like a foreign population that had to be controlled. And that was one of the purposes of the United Church, to go into these areas. And what they called mission work was actually identifying the indigenous, the traditional leaders, and wiping them out. Like often what missionaries would do is literally with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, they would go into the houses of the traditional chiefs and throw them out, evict them. Then they would bring in Christian Native chiefs, and they would replace the traditional chief.
Really?
And, yeah, I mean, that happened all over the country. And the families targeted for sterilization were usually the traditional chiefs who didn't want to go along with the church and the government. They were literally wiped out. And so a lot of the chiefs today are not actually the original chiefs. They were brought in. They were kind of like the collaborating, like you get in any system of colonialism. You had a certain group of people collaborating, and they were the ones who were elevated to positions of authority, and they're the ones actually who are running a lot of the Native groups in Canada today. So it's that whole legacy of colonialism that we're dealing with.
My God, it's an incredible story. And you mentioned before here the Indian Act of Canada. And as far as I understood it, while watching your film, of course, says that the Indians have a legal status of a child or even a mentally ill. Is that correct?
That's right. There's the Indian Act. If you look at the wording, right in the preamble, it says, and this was an act brought in 1874 and has never changed, really. It's still in effect. And it says, Indians are legal wards of the state in perpetuity, which means until the end of time. And a ward of the state is you can't handle your own affairs. The government appoints a ward to act on your behalf, so you can't go to court. You're not considered a legal entity. You can't open a bank account, and none of that. So under the Indian Act, that's the status of Native people. And, as such, they can treat Native people any way they like.
Yeah.
A perfect example of that is recently the government's been, because of a lot of the work I've been doing, this information is finally coming out, and so the government was forced to, last year, not only acknowledge the high death rate, but start issuing what they call compensation to, financial compensation to survivors of these death camps, really, called residential schools. And they're only offering $10,000, if you can believe it. $10,000 to a survivor is all they get, and they have to prove they went to a school. Well, how many people can do that? How do they have access to that paperwork? Most people have been disqualified because they can't prove they went to a school. Elsewhere, when the churches are sued for sexual abuse, like in the United States, the survivors are getting $1-2 million compensation. But in Canada, a Native person is worth 1% of that, and they know they have to take it because there's no way legally they can say to the government, no, I'm not going to, because they're wards of the state. So they're really in a dilemma, and it's interesting that I believe that after World War II, the United Nations actually banned race-based legislation, which is why the apartheid